What happens when an open source project goes bad? We fork. Hey guys, it's Josh from the WL Tech blog. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite parts of open source software. Let's get started. It's fair to say that free and open source software is a huge part of most of our computing lives, whether we know it or not. Obviously, for Linux and BSD users, you're likely using an operating system made of 90% or more free software, maybe higher if you paid attention to what hardware you have in your system. But even Microsoft and Apple operating systems have a ton of it as well. Well, historically, mostly taken from Linux and BSD projects, but in modern times, they've made some contributions as well. A successful open source project will score well on a few major metrics. Obviously, number one is the open source license, and the freedom it grants to both users and developers. But beyond that, a good project will also have good documentation, community engagement, especially with folks asking for help, and be open to new features being contributed by their users. Inevitably, useful open source projects that fail at these get forked, and sometimes those forks become the new standard. Here's an example. Back in 2015, an open source project I wanted to use was bought out by a company. When I say bought out, the company paid the developer enough money that he removed all the public repos with the goal of preventing that company's proprietary product from competing with the open source software. Fortunately for me, that software had been released under an open source license, and the previous releases could still be found with a little effort. I was able to find the most recent open source release and use it as a starting point for a fork, which quickly surpassed the original in popularity. Right away, I added some basic things like support for 64-bit operating systems, which were a relatively recent thing at the time, but also fixed quite a few crash bugs and some potential security fixes. Over the last 10 years or so, I've maintained a fork of it on GitHub, mostly continuing to implement bug fixes and compatibility with newer operating systems and compilers, but a few new features along the way. The original project is long since gone, but the code lives on, and a few people have even forked mine with their own goals in mind, although as of today, none have actually overtaken it. Maybe you've heard some of the noise of previously open source projects changing their license because of Amazon or other cloud providers offering hosted versions of their software, often competing against the creator's own products. One example is Amazon's fork of Elasticsearch. Amazon was making quite a lot of money selling it as a service, but being open source software, they weren't required to pay for it. Elastic themselves had several commercial offerings around it as well, making them direct competitors. So the choice they made was to relicense the software to a proprietary license which Amazon could no longer use for free. Unsurprisingly, Amazon instead chose to fork the last open source version and launch the OpenSearch project. Now, I'm not saying Amazon is a good guy here. I'm a proponent of supporting free software developers where you can. But Elastic's move wasn't just unfriendly to Amazon, it was unfriendly to all of us. Users and developers who contributed to Elastic lost rights to their own contributions, betrayed by corporate interests. Meanwhile, OpenSearch has continued to develop and is bound by that original open source license, and seems to be doing well as a good citizen of the open source community. This is a high-profile example, but examples of smaller projects changing their licenses are plentiful. When you decide to create an open source project, the license may seem trivial at the time. My little search tool probably won't become $1 million revenue generator. Nearly all new open source projects will exist to serve a need the author had that maybe nobody else has, or is already served by existing projects. Lots of software just sucks, or is a learning project not expected to be used by anyone. I personally do that all the time, implementing a package for doing various types of caches or containers and things like that to practice in a new language, even though hundreds or thousands of implementations may already exist. But if you create something that gets traction, you may someday find yourself in the same situation as Elastic. Open source licenses aren't a gimmick, and they're not a way to get free developer labor on your company's project. They're a commitment to your users and community that they share in the ownership of the software, and the time and energy invested in it will benefit everyone. So what we're talking about today is an open source project that I really wanted to like, and one I've discussed on this channel before. As you likely already know, one of the projects we're doing is taking inexpensive home security type cameras and replacing their proprietary firmware with our own, to not only remove monthly subscription costs and enhance the features, but also to ensure your privacy. I did a video up here explaining some of the big reasons why you want to do this. Check it out when you're done with this one. But as I often say, nothing is ever easy. The project in question fails in nearly every category when it comes to being a good open source project. And what happens next is exactly what you expect. Let's quickly go over some of the shortcomings that led to it. The glaring one is the fact that there are proprietary pieces in use. In fact, arguably, the largest and most critical piece is in fact a closed source project. The code that does all the work, taking the raw data from the camera and turning it into various formats for streaming or recording. This has always raised an eyebrow, but becomes a real issue when you're trying to do new things, or add features, or port to a new platform like RISC-V. You're at the mercy of that developer to provide a binary, which they may or may not choose to do. Being such an integral part of the platform really spoils the rest of the project, which is almost a life support system for that proprietary code. The second failing I'd point out is poor interaction that users have with the original project. The developers are in fact available on Discord and Telegram and other places, but when questions are asked, they rarely provide a better response than RTFM. You might say that RTFM can usually be an adequate response, but in this case that manual is often inaccurate, incomplete, or otherwise just not helpful. In my experience, the community is at best neutral, but often leaning towards negative for new users. Third, relationships with developers haven't been very good either. It's not surprising that most contributions come from a small number of developers. Nearly all projects operate the same way. However, when the project reacts to new feature submissions with hostility, going as far as to take steps to ensure that your changes can't work by actively trying to detect them, that's just going in the wrong direction. This is an unfortunate place we found ourselves, and unsurprisingly, we're here talking about how open source gives us a solution. This isn't actually a project announcement video, not yet at least. That's coming soon, but we have goals in place before we go too public. Our project is different, largely because the people involved have felt the pains mentioned above and don't think that users should have to deal with them. We've taken some of the good bits from that original project, but very little of it actually remains. We've written our own software to interface with the camera hardware and encoders. We've modified an existing open source project to do the various protocols for network streaming and saving. We've rewritten the UI to expose options you actually use instead of a confusing list of things you may not understand. And we're targeting specific camera models with out-of-the-box working configs instead of expecting end users to dig through our documentation to figure out their Wi-Fi drivers, GPIO pins, camera sensors, etc. on their own. Not to mention a host of new features the original project hasn't gotten around to implementing because their proprietary developer just hasn't bothered to. We have a few camera models which our developers have in their hands that will be supported first, focusing on currently available models that are both high quality and low cost. It's amazing what you can get for $15 on Amazon. We also have a couple that were very popular and are easily found on the used market as well. As these targets mature, I'll be doing full install and setup videos on them, as well as some content around general usage. One of my personal goals is that you be able to run our software without sacrificing useful features provided by the manufacturer's proprietary code. We're not quite there yet, but development is happening at a fast pace, and we've long since surpassed the old project in terms of stability and performance. If you're interested in joining that effort, it's all being done over at our Discord channel, which I've linked in the description. Well, that's about it for this video. Things are moving really quickly, and I think we'll have an actual announcement video with a real device very, very soon, so make sure to subscribe to get that. This and other fun projects are all in flight over at the Hackers Homestead Discord channel. We've got stuff for hobbyists of all skill levels, especially if you like cameras and little Linux boxes. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been burned by an open source project, or your experience forking someone else's code to make it work for your own use case. Don't forget to like this video, and we'll see you next time. Stay fresh, cheesebags.